Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Northern Corridor Research Program webinar series. Thanks for joining us today. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary is on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I'm Marcia Nelson, an Executive Fellow at the School of Public Policy, and I'm happy to be your moderator today. This series is part of the output of the Canadian Northern Corridor Research Program at the School of Public Policy, which is exploring the potential of this incredibly ambitious concept. And you can find out more about this program at www.canadiancorridor.ca. So today we're going to dive into what I think is an incredibly interesting topic on the governance options for the Canadian Northern Corridor. For those of you who have joined us for some of the presentations of the past, we've had a number of questions come up in those seminars related to the governance issues of this kind of a pan-Canadian infrastructure project. So I think it's going to be really exciting for us today to delve deeply into these questions. And I know we're going to have plenty of time for questions after the presentation. So please do submit your questions as they pop up by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. So at this time, I think we'll jump right to the presentation. We have two colleagues joining us, only one of which is with us right now, and hopefully the other will be able to join us very soon. Andrei Sulzenko is the Executive Fellow at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary, and Katharina Koch is our postdoctoral associate at the Canadian Northern Corridor Research Program at the School of Public Policy in the University of Calgary. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Katharina and we'll get started. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcia. Let me just share my screen. Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Katharina Koch, and today we are going to talk about a very interesting topic about the governance of the corridor. And I know that those of you who have already participated in some of the previous presentations, you are all probably very familiar already with the Northern Corridor concept itself. So I won't give a long introduction, just that it is a long-term solution to Canada's geographic, political, legal, and economic challenges for providing growth and diversification in Canada, focusing also particularly on the north, and that the corridor should be an approved multimodal rights-of-way corridor. And the development of the Northern Corridor concept was initially a response to the challenges faced by resource-based provinces and territories in transporting commodities to Asian and European markets, thereby reducing overwhelming reliance on the US market and associated lower prices. And the concept also promotes enhanced economic and social development in the north and near north because of new cost-lowering infrastructure, as well as reduced congestion on existing southern networks. Given the geographical breadth of the Northern Corridor, issues and questions of governance must be addressed from the beginning in order to analyze its overall feasibility and desirability. We expect that particularly consensus building and agreements will require numerous rounds of negotiations, consultations, and reviews. Given the pan-Canadian character, corridor planning and implementation will involve a large stakeholder and rights holder network that includes federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, as well as Indigenous communities, private corporations, and also the general Canadian public. A key feature of the concept is to have federal, provincial, and territorial governments and Indigenous communities to agree on a corridor right-of-way that would then give greater certainty for potential investments in roads, railways, pipelines, transmission lines, and port facilities within that right-of-way. So it is a prerequisite to lowering the risks and costs of subsequent public and private capital investment in specific projects. And the rollout of a new northern corridor will take multiple decades to achieve at a cost in possibly the tens of billions of dollars. It is critical, therefore, to have a robust and enduring framework for decision-making, governance structures, and processes. And the corridor, or these processes should be, government stakeholders, they need to be aware that the process of the corridor implementation will transcend shorter term mandates of elected officials. And the main premise of our paper on governance is that sustainable outcomes require early and ongoing participation as well as oversight involving the broader community. Also, there's no one right way to achieve these results, and our paper sets out various options consistent with this premise at each stage of corridor development. Lastly, there's also the leadership question. Such a complex task involving multiple stakeholders over many years will not be achieved spontaneously. The only entity with a pan-Canadian perspective and the accompanying financial resources is the federal government. Whether it will take up the challenge remains to be seen, but this and other research papers should help to inform that decision. Our research has been informed by numerous planned and existing infrastructure projects and initiatives across Canada. One of these projects is, for example, the Grace Bay Port and Road Project, which is led by the Kitikmeot Association, or KIA, which goal it is to build a 227-kilometer all-season road to connect Canada's slave geological province with Arctic shipping routes. Currently, estimated costs sit at $500 million, and originally the majority of these this funding, or 75%, was to be sourced from the federal government. But so far, only 5%, or 21.5 million, were granted by the federal government in 2019. Another regulatory authority that we also studied is the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board, which also includes the Gwich'in, Satu, and Wikisi Land and Water Boards. And we studied these boards because we assume that they will also play a very important role in our Northern Corridor concept, in the Northern Corridor context. The Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board is a regulatory authority which was established with the Mackenzie Resource Management Act, which has created and provided authorities to a number of boards in the Northwest Territories to carry out land use planning, to regulate the use of land and water, and to conduct environmental impact assessments. So in this regard, we do expect that also our Northern Corridor or Northern Corridor governance will also very closely consult or negotiate with these land and water boards in the Northwest Territories, because also a major portion of the route for now is envisioned to cross through the Northwest Territories as well. To get a sense of past infrastructure projects, we also studied, for example, the St. Lawrence Seaway Commission and the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is a major shipping route connecting the Atlantic Ocean with the Great Lakes. And it took over 50 years to complete. So negotiations took quite a long time between Canada and the US. And even though it is a binational project, which includes the United States, we can still learn from this long negotiation process, and we can gauge that also Northern Corridor negotiations will take quite a long time. Also, another project that we studied, even though it was cancelled because we can learn quite a bit from it, is the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline and Aboriginal Pipeline Group. This pipeline was envisioned to transport natural gas from the Mackenzie Delta to the south, including the US. Planning of the pipeline already began in the 1970s with the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, but Justice Burgers suggested a 10-year moratorium in order to settle Indigenous land claims. The project was granted federal approval in 2011, but by 2016, the costs had risen to $16 billion. And also, we are currently facing unfavorable market conditions. And as a result, stakeholders started to pull out, and also the cooperation with the Aboriginal Pipeline Group was dissolved. So based on these analyzed projects and authorities, we have identified 4 key stages of corridor implementation. I want to emphasize here that this is not an exhaustive list. They could include many more steps. Also these steps are not consecutive. They may actually overlap depending on the final governance structure. But so far, according to our research, Canadian Northern Corridor development will at least move through the following stages. The first one is to develop the initial policy framework. The second one is to decide on a corridor route, to review and implement project proposals as RFPs are being published, and to manage ongoing operations and oversight. We also have found a number of potential obstacles that could disrupt consensus seeking between rights and stakeholders. For example, delays could happen due to misinformation, or courts could deem consultations with Indigenous peoples as insufficient, as it has happened in the past with natural resource projects, for example. And based on this, we have developed 5 operating principles that we argue could help offset such challenges. Again, these principles are not final, but we hope that they offer a suitable basis to begin discussions about the requirements of a policy framework. Regarding the initial policy framework, we argue that support should come from the federal government in close cooperation with provincial and territorial governments. Regarding the implementation, this should be based on a cooperative relationship between governments, businesses, and Indigenous peoples. And governance, we argue that because governments are suitable to provide a regulatory strategy that organizes business planning and funding for specific projects. And in this regard, we also argue, because we assume that negotiations between stake and rights holders will be quite complicated, and it will be difficult to actually even reach a consensus, we also put forward the proposal to establish the Northern Corridor in a segmented manner to facilitate timely project development, because it may be easier to organize project development in accordance to distinct geographical portions of the corridor. The third principle is closely related. It is about stakeholder involvement. Although the federal government could take indeed a lead role in developing the initial framework, the third principle especially underlines that provincial, territorial governments and Indigenous peoples need to be considered as equal partners throughout all the stages we have previously identified. And as I already hinted at, the fourth principle is about the time frame. Based on our research of previous projects, implementation of the corridor will very likely transcend multiple 4-year mandates of governments. This means that the governance framework must achieve overarching governmental support and commitment in the long run. And the last principle is about flexible governance. We recognize that a single governance model for the corridor may not be sufficient for all project stages, especially if implementation overlaps, in the sense that some projects are ready to go ahead earlier than others. For this, we may require multiple or flexible governance structures that respond to an incremental implementation. So as a result, in our paper, we have identified various governance options. These are not exclusive, but they do reflect the most likely choices according to our current research. So regarding the development of the initial policy framework, recent experience gained from infrastructure development here in Canada, for example, in the context of pipelines, such as the Keystone XL, but also other infrastructure projects. The most recent one, the A2A railway, demonstrate that there are very severe challenges of reconciling competing interests in infrastructure development. This also shows us that there is often a leadership vacuum that could support consensus seeking among disagreeing stakeholders. And here in Canada, we argue in our paper, such leadership could come from the federal government as it has the mandate to formulate national goals. And regarding the routing, in order to make corridor routing negotiations manageable, they could be divided into different segments, concentrating responsibility to relevant key stakeholders within a dedicated geographic area. And as a result, there's also a choice to be made between centralized or decentralized models, such as the usage of routing committees. At the project proposal stage, there is a fundamental choice to be made on governance structure and process, either to deploy existing institutions and regulatory processes or to establish a special corridor corporation that reviews all projects within the designated right-of-way. And if the option of a crown or not-for-profit corporation were chosen as the instrument for project selection and review, for the purpose of continuity, it would also make sense to give this corporation the mandate to oversee the operations of the approved projects, including responsibility for ensuring proper maintenance and repair. However, oversight may be delegated to a separate institution to also ensure independency. So throughout the research, we have thus identified three main governance approaches. The first one is a single corporation mandated to drive all three corridor implementation stages. So the routing, reviewing, managing, and oversight, or a decentralized existing instruments regime that responds to demands from stakeholder groups as they arise. We are also suggesting a hybrid approach, which is a mixture between a centralized and decentralized governance model, and it would apply to different stages of CNC implementation. Under this approach, the process of deciding an overall corridor route or different segments of the corridor could perhaps be best achieved through a committee process. The same decentralized approach could apply in the next phase to the review of project proposals, since existing instruments are already in place for various transportation modes. The management and oversight phase does not, however, lend itself to a decentralized approach, which would be the antithesis of an integrated multimodal corridor as we are envisioning it. Here, possibly a single entity would serve best this purpose. So in our paper, Andrei and I have developed a potential government's decision-making approach. This is the hybrid model. This framework, as I cannot emphasize enough, is based on our research up until now. So further research will still modify these steps by raising additional questions and measures that we may not yet have considered. So the first step would be that the federal government offers a major policy statement, potentially in a speech from the throne, to promote a multi-year initiative for the development of a new pan-Canadian transportation corridor, and a designated lead minister could engage with provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments to determine interest in the initiative, leading perhaps to a white paper outlining the federal position, which could then be distributed for further discussion. Also, furthermore, a committee of governments and Indigenous stakeholders, and possibly with private sector observers, should develop routing recommendations, as well as priorities in terms of location and transportation modes. Initial investments in the corridor are developed, reviewed, and approved through existing instruments, for example. And once there is sufficient activity within the corridor, Governments could consider whether progress would be facilitated through the establishment of more formal governance structures, for example, the designation of a special corporate entity, which could be a crown or a not-for-profit corporation, or more a decentralized framework, for example, by utilizing designated special committees, for example. If a corporation would be chosen, the corporation would have the mandate to issue RFPs for new transportation infrastructure, to review proposals, to lead construction contracts, and to monitor progress. And public accountability would be structured in accordance with requirements related to the corporate structure. Should a management corporation, however, not be considered a feasible option, at a minimum, an independent corridor operations and oversight body should be established for broad accountability. And the responsible federal lead minister that was appointed in the beginning or later on should report annually on the CNC progress and make recommendations for further actions by governments and other stakeholders. So I hope that we managed to give you an idea of where our research stands on the governance of a corridor governance model. But as you can imagine, there are also still a lot of future research avenues that we still have to pursue and forthcoming questions that we have to tackle in order to get a better sense of the final governance scenario. So some of the forthcoming research avenues that we are suggesting is to provide detailed scenarios for CNC development in terms of geographic and modal priorities, including evaluation of a likely timeline and performance trade-offs of various governance structures and processes, an up-to-date inventory of existing infrastructure projects and initiatives that currently exist or are underway, and to which extent the corridor could complement these, and especially to gain insight from Indigenous communities along the notional corridor route or beyond. Our current route is conceptual. Thus, our task is to gauge the interest and viability of a corridor route, and thus engagement with Indigenous communities will offer beneficial insight for developing a governance framework. And since we have established that both a crown corporation or a not-for-profit corporation are indeed viable options at this stage, it would be beneficial to study their advantages or disadvantages in the context of the Canadian Northern Corridor. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I'm looking forward to the discussion and answering all the questions you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Katharina. That was terrific. And welcome, Andrei. Thanks for joining us today. And we'll be sure to put some questions to you as well. Maybe what I'll start with is a broad concept, because if you think about the corridor, the concept of a corridor really takes the current planning process and stands it on its head. So the current process is where, projects, proponents identify a project, they identify their own route, they try and get approvals, they consult afterward, and there's really no coordination. Whereas with a corridor, we're looking at establishing a process to achieve consensus on routing and coordinating projects, and then later deciding on projects. So you've said in your paper that painstaking consensus building is key. And I guess the question I would put is, what would you say to folks who would say the fact that there are so many stakeholders, so many disparate interests, that really the weight of that, the weight of the number of stakeholders will just crush this kind of initiative? What would you say to folks from that perspective?
Let me take a shot at it. Hello, everyone. Apologies for being late. There's a time zone issue for me, and anyway, I'm now on your time zone. Look, that's a huge question, and for which I don't think there's a really, really good answer, because you're right. I mean, if you look at Canada's history, it's very difficult to come to consensus on almost anything when you're involving many jurisdictions and many different groups. And this is a project, so it'll span many decades, many jurisdictions, cost a lot of money. So it is a Herculean task, there's no doubt. But I guess our view, or at least certainly my view, is that there's no other way to do it. It may not work, but there's no other way to do it. Because unless you get buy-in from the major participants, it's not going to happen. So you got to, your basic premise has to be everybody has to get in the tent and negotiate the best possible outcome for themselves. And otherwise it won't happen. I mean, you know, when we built the railway, I don't know, in the 19th century, that was pretty straightforward. You had a prime minister who wanted to do it. You had some financiers who said, here's the money, and they just did it. Well, you can't do that anymore. And this is a project that's actually going to be bigger than that railway. So I guess, you know, if you said, well, what do you think the probability would be of pulling this off? Oh, I'd say well under 50% because of the reason that you raised.
So on that point, one of the questioners asks, is there a role for the Council of the Federation? You know, we're having a First Ministers meeting today, right? So there's a teleconference that's happening today where the First Ministers will be getting together and talking about healthcare funding, pandemic response, a number of things. And usually in the lead up to those meetings, the Council of the Federation, which is basically all the provincial premiers and territorial leaders meeting together in advance of meeting with First Ministers. They get together to try and get themselves sorted out before they meet with the federal government. So do you think there's a role here for the Council of the Federation to try and, you know, begin the work of trying to generate consensus?
I think
clearly.
this, oh, yeah, I think this would this would definitely be an option, because maybe even before the federal ministers jump into place, it would be very important to also raise or to raise awareness for the corridor also within the provinces and territories to establish if this is actually desirable according to various geographical location, and then such council of or the federal, if the provincial and federal ministers, if they come together, they could create a really good basis for trying to establish where could be some consensus, but also then where are some of the discordant voices. So it would be an excellent way before, let's say, carrying it to the federal level. But please jump in, Andrei.
No, my only point on in supplementing what Katharina has said is that I don't know which year now. It's probably a couple of years ago. This issue was on their agenda.
Yes.
And they all agreed this was a great idea that should be pursued. And the only exception to, I don't know if it was in the communique or the press conference or whatever, was that Quebec said, well, yeah, interesting, but as long as it doesn't include pipelines. So they obviously, you know, their politics are quite specific on that issue, given that they've blocked a number of previous pipeline proposals. But I don't take that as a deal breaker. And in fact, frankly, I'm not sure this corridor would be mainly about pipelines in any event.
Yes. So it's interesting you'd raise that, Andrei. I was just going to say that I recall that communique. I recall the interest being expressed by First Ministers on that. And Quebec at the time, you know, they were interested in hydroelectric transmission and broadband and some other things, but kind of weren't prepared to sign on at that time. In this vein, have you delivered your research to intergovernmental affairs ministers, or is there a plan to make sure that the research out of this initiative is shared federally and provincially?
Well, I don't know what the school's plans are for, I mean, it's now a public document. I don't know what the school's plans are for how we roll it out in terms of dialogue with the various groups, but obviously, the federal government would be an early call, because in my view, nothing will happen here unless the federal government is on board one way or another.
Again, interesting that you raised that, because I have a number of questions related to the issue of leadership and a leadership vacuum, and how we can talk about structures, and the paper certainly talks about a number of structures, but the essential ingredient is leadership. And you've talked in your paper, and I've certainly talked in other forums about how critically important the leadership of the federal government is, not least of which because they have the constitutional authority to make sure interjurisdictional projects of this nature occur. So what do you think would need to occur to basically create the burning platform, right, to have federal leadership be asserted in this area? What's it going to take to get the interest of the federal government to move on this?
Again, these are big questions. Certainly, it would be a big challenge for the current government. Mm-hmm. And the reason I'd say that is that this issue has been portrayed by its proponents and its antagonists as one that is, put forward quite starkly. The proponents, like the Premier of Alberta, for example, wants to get his oil to markets. That's the message, and this is an important tool in trying to do that over the longer term. The opposition would say this is, we don't want any more oil extraction or piping and so on and so forth. So the current government is kind of caught in that. I mean, we'd have to reframe the issue in publicly away from what it is currently in order for, let's say, a federal government to take this on. And I think that's possible, but unfortunately, the politicians have already framed it in those stark terms. So it would be, I think, very difficult for this government to take something like that on, because they're saying they want a green agenda. Well, arguably, this goes against a green agenda, unless, I think it can be made compatible, but at the moment, there's no political interest, I think, in doing so. Katharina, I don't know. Yeah.
I can add to that as well, because I think also what we have seen now on the political level, there is a federal taste for infrastructure. So it was reinforced with the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework that was published in 2019. That also emphasizes infrastructure development in Northern and Indigenous communities. So there is definitely the federal focus on infrastructure development, all kinds of infrastructure in the North, the Canadian North and the Arctic. COVID-19 has happened, but it also has showed us that the government is also very interested in shovel-ready infrastructure projects. Of course, the Northern Corridor is nowhere near being shovel-ready, but I think it emphasizes the federal position that also infrastructure is part of the post-COVID-19 recovery strategy. And also there have been made these very important announcements, for example, of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, to invest $10 billion into several infrastructure sectors. I mean, for example, broadband, green energy, public transit. And the Northern Corridor could certainly also contribute to these federal goals. Because, as we always emphasize, it is not only an energy corridor, it is a multimodal corridor that includes all kinds of infrastructure, including, for example, broadband.
Absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about First Ministers meetings, Council of the Federation, but we haven't delved into the role of Indigenous groups. And clearly, Indigenous groups are essential in any conversation about linear infrastructure, things moving across the land. And I thought it was interesting that in your paper, you talked about the fact that Indigenous groups presenting to the 2017 Senate committee were largely favorably disposed to a corridor concept. So maybe it was just the folks that were presenting, but there was certainly a contingent of Indigenous representatives that were very supportive of a corridor concept. So how do you think Indigenous groups would be best engaged in this kind of an initiative? Are we talking about some kind of truly, partite institution that has federal, provincial, Indigenous, co-management, or are we talking about consultation, or what's your thinking on that?
I can take that on, and if Andrei wants to jump in later. So first of all, we consider Indigenous peoples and communities as rights holders. So they have a very unique position. They are not only stakeholders, but they are rights holders, which is also reinforced by several courts since many years. And we need to be aware that large portions of the corridor are envisioned to at least pass Indigenous communities and Indigenous lands. So they are extremely important also decision makers. And our goal is to perhaps to go beyond consultation, the duty to consult, because in the past it has been also extensively studied from an academic perspective that these consultations, there are many shortcomings that can lead to delays of infrastructure projects, as we have seen, for example, with the Keystone XL pipeline, where in the end, the Federal Court of Appeals was arguing that the consultations were not sufficient. So we have to approach this topic very carefully and very consciously, and to also mitigate these kinds of delays that may be faced by corridor development later on. So what my key message is, without Indigenous participation and decision-making, a northern corridor won't be possible.
So one of our questioners asks whether you have considered the governance model of the co-management boards in the Northwest Territories, because I think that you mentioned the land and water boards in the Mackenzie Valley, but the question here is, couldn't we do something like that? Because this is an independent board with equal representation from federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments, and then potentially we could weave in some of the private sector.
Well, that would be a good model. And in fact, just to add to Katharina's comments, I don't think this will happen unless Indigenous groups not only are direct participants, but also have a real stake in it. And I mean an equity stake in the project. So as by way of example, the Mackenzie gas resurrection of some years ago, there was a group called they called it the Aboriginal Pipeline Group, and included most of the Indigenous communities along the route. Not all of them, because some were still holding out because of land claim settlement issues, but they were keen because they were looking for a third of the project from an equity perspective. And that's what drove them. I mean, it was an economic development issue for their own people. And I think for this project, if it goes ahead, it would be dependent on that same kind of principle. And the people that, the various groups that testified before the Senate committee, that was clear from all of them that they wanted a piece of the action. So I think that's has to be your basic premise.
Great. One of the concepts you spoke of in the paper, and certainly in your presentation, was this idea of segmenting the corridor across different jurisdictions. So can you talk a little bit more about that and what you mean? Because when we talk about a corridor, we all think of a single, kind of runway, all connected all across, coast to coast to coast. So what's this concept of segmenting and what value does it add to this enterprise?
Yeah, so this came up during our research. It was not an initial idea we had, but as we were researching and analyzing these previous infrastructure models, regulatory authorities, and so on, we realized the breadth of stakeholders and rights holders involved. And we know that consensus building will be a key challenge already in the very first stage of developing the initial policy framework. So as a result, we were thinking that it could make sense to segment the corridor into various geographical portions. How these portions are later on divided needs to be seen also as the routing of the corridor is being decided. But in this way, it could make sense to portion the corridor and to kind of diminish the amount of stakeholders within the corridor according to these geographical portions. Because in the end, it is a pan-Canadian corridor. It will cross territorial and provincial boundaries that all have different types of jurisdictions according to different policy domains. So this could also be a way to mitigate discordant voices and disagreement. But it requires further research to see how to effectively divide the corridor, but still always keeping the discourse of this is a pan-Canadian corridor. It is functioning under one single initial, let's say, policy framework. But that is also why I emphasize so much that we may need several governance options. We need flexible governance because different governance scenarios may kind of interlap they overlap within the corridor, the development of the corridor.
Well, let me go back to that, the sort of the governance models. I've got a couple questions here about the difference between considering a for-profit and a not-for-profit structure. And legally, one of the key differences between a not-for-profit and a for-profit structure is whether or not there's ownership, right? And the questioner asked, did you consider how an ownership model could address some of the shared objectives with Indigenous ownership and revenue participation, as well as creating a mechanism for the private sector to invest? So it follows on that comment you made, Andrei, about an equity stake.
Well, I think we're getting a little mixed up with on concepts here, because what we were trying to deal with in the paper was the overall decision-making process.
Yes.
And we didn't see that as a for-profit entity, because the decision-making is really a way of making sure all the stakeholders, and this is governments and Indigenous groups, have a say in outcomes. On an individual project basis, well, that's different. So that you obviously could have a for-profit model. Let's say there was a great renewed interest in resurrecting some version of a Mackenzie Valley corridor, which I know that NWT has wanted to do for decades. So there could be a corporation set up to do that, which could be for profit. But what we were dealing with wasn't that so much in our paper as really the stakeholder groups and how they would come to a consensus on the framework. So I think there's lots of room for profit on projects which would include the Indigenous groups.
So it's important to distinguish in the development of the corridor itself. That takes a governance model, and we've been talking about various models for that. And then the actual projects, which then exist within the corridor, there are lots of models as well, and certainly for-profit are the ones that frankly, I think make the most sense there. So back to models again. Could you talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of a centralized corporation? You know, we talked about a crown corporation or some other type of not-for-profit versus maybe a decentralized special committee. I mean, those are both options that you've raised in the paper.
Well, let me start. Katharina, I'm sure, has some comments too. I think the clear advantage of a centralized approach is speed, because you've got one entity that's making a lot of the decisions now. It could be with major consultation at all steps, but it would be an entity that would drive it. That would be its purpose in being. And, so a crown corporation, let's say, that was set up at a federal level, that would be the main driver of the corridor. So that would not only, improve the coordination, but it would also make things go more quickly. The problem with it, of course, and that's why we think a decentralized approach on some aspects may actually work better in the long run, is that there may be some, animosity to having it centralized. I mean, we are in effect a decentralized federation, so it may not go down as well, even though it may be the most efficient way. So that's why we're saying you gotta, work this through in a way that without predetermining what the best model is.
Yeah, I agree with Andrei. The advantage of having, for example, a crown corporation or not-for-profit organization is also that we already have existing legislation about this. We have the Not-for-Profit Act, for example, that regulates how such a corporation could be set up. So it could facilitate establishing such a corporation, but it may not be suitable, as Andrei said, to respond effectively to the diversity of interests that we envision in the corridor model, and thus a decentralized model may be more effective in the end, even though for this one requires, it doesn't have this pre-existing, let's say, legislation act or how it should be set up. So this also requires a lot of negotiations, especially also regarding accountability and oversight, for example.
So we can't talk about governance and a kind of leadership and interprovincial planning without really talking about politics, right? So, the paper certainly talked about electoral politics, that this project would certainly span over a time frame that goes well beyond a 4-year electoral cycle. But there's also the politics of kind of Indigenous rights holders, non-governmental organizations, climate politics, and of course all the interprovincial politics that we've talked a little bit about of it right now. So could you talk a little bit about some of the political challenges that you see influencing the Canadian Northern Corridor concept, or what the political challenges are that influencing arriving at a governance model?
I think Andrei has a lot of experience regarding the situation that we are currently in a minority government. So Andrei, please.
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, we're currently at the federal level in a minority government, but more fundamentally, I mean, governments in this country are on 4-year cycles. So here's the issue. Even if you had tomorrow total consensus on how to proceed, who knows where you're going to be in the next 3 or 4 years as new governments get elected. They may have a different point of view. So the continuity of purpose will be very, very difficult to achieve. And that's another reason why we think in our lean in the paper towards a fairly decentralized approach to this, because if you develop consensus almost from the bottom up, then it's very hard for new top-down decisions to wreck it all. So, but that's the, you know, if you asked us, well, what is the most difficult thing to be dealt with in this for this project? It's the fact that governments change all the time, and different priorities, and or they may even say, we don't think that's a good idea at all, and that's problem, because this is a multi-decade initiative.
Yes. And of course, governments don't all share the same objectives. You know, one of the questioners basically says, you know, the northern corridor is really designed to serve regions that are currently underserved with respect to, you know, critical trade moving infrastructure. And so the challenge is, how do you have these underserved regions who really need this kind of infrastructure convince other regions that it's a great idea? So what are your thoughts on that, about some of the kind of regional politics here that are involved?
Well, just to take up on your point, I mean, there are two landlocked provinces in this country. One is where you are right now, and the other is its neighbor. They need this more than anything else, because if over time you want to diversify your access beyond the great neighbor to the south, you need access to ports, you need access to water. And that's what the corridor would do for Alberta and Saskatchewan. It would give them access which they do not now have for their output. So they obviously have a prime interest in pursuing the concept. Others less so. We thought for a while that in fact Ontario might even be interested, because the corridor could open up what is called the Ring of Fire, which is south of James Bay in Ontario, which is a very resource-rich area, but there's absolutely no way of getting there. So, but that project is kind of certainly in limbo because of the enormous expense that would be involved in developing it. So you will have huge regional variations. And that's one of the reasons why, coming back to your question on segmenting, the most obvious segment to prove up the concept would be in the West, linking Alberta and Saskatchewan to the West Coast and potentially to the James Bay, so that they would have access to European markets through let's say, Churchill. That would be an obvious place to start, because that's where the greatest need is.
Great.
I would
So
also.
you mentioned, oh, sorry, go ahead, Katharina.
Well, I would also add to that, because you were mentioning how to convince, let's say, other regions that they also should be interested in it. And when I think about the North and underdevelopment in the North, we also found, and we elaborated this as well in another paper, that there will be spillover effects. So developing infrastructure in northern remote communities, let's say, there will be economic, social spillover effects for the whole of Canada. So I think that could be a message on how to promote the corridor concept as well.
Great. Well, Andrei, you mentioned access to ports, and one of the audience members wonders whether we considered the Port Authority model as a model. You know, it's a federal infrastructure. They usually have representation from sort of related provinces and other interests. Is that a model that you considered?
Katharina, remind me, I don't think we looked at that as directly, because there were others that were more obvious, but just on the point of the ports, I mean, that one of the keys to all this is to upgrade the ports for export. And Churchill is basically moribund right now. But if you look over time, the shortest route to Europe is through there. And obviously the West Coast is laden with many political issues, But you know, Asia is going to be a major market for the next 30 years for sure. So those are obvious port issues that stick out like a sore thumb. And I would say that the government of the Northwest Territories would really like to upgrade their facilities, you know, on the Arctic as well.
Yeah, yeah, we haven't considered yet, let's say, potential port locations that could be included in the Northern Corridor. We have based our study on, for example, the Grace Bay Port and Road project. So from that, we know there is definitely taste or interest to have Arctic or ports located also along the Northwest Passage, which in itself brings a whole bunch of other questions that we cannot go into right now. But yeah, this will also be discussed in forthcoming research for sure.
Well, that was going to be my last question as we close here. Based on the work that you've done, what do you think the next steps for additional research need to be?
So from a research perspective, we definitely have to analyze these governance options that Andrei and that we have kind of worked out, because yeah, they are not the final options, right? As our research progresses, we will also still modify the analysis and our views, and it will change. Maybe some options will be added. But for now, viable options, for example, Crown Corporation, not-for-profit corporation, a separate study about these should be definitely be done in order to understand what the clear advantages and disadvantages. And also, yeah, how actually regarding the routing, what are viable routing options? And this will require, this is very important research that will require quite a lot of time as well.
Well, thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, that's the last question that we'll be able to address in the time frame that we have. It has been an excellent discussion this morning, so thank you both very much. And I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the additional research roll out, because it seems the more research we do, the more questions that we uncover and more work that needs to be done. So thank you, Andrei and Katharina, for joining us today. Thank all of you in the audience for tuning in and asking great questions. And that's our seminar for today. Thanks, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Marcia.